I'm Kristen, and this is Crafting with Kristen. Today I'm going to show you guys how to make a band t-shirt into a cute little crop top. I have this humanoid shirt that my friend Julia gave me, and we are going to be making it into this. First, we're going to go over all of the supplies that you're going to need to do this project. First thing you're going to need, obviously, is a band t-shirt. I would recommend, since it's a crop top and you're not going to have a lot of space, something with a smaller logo or something you're not going to mind cropping off the bottom half of it. You're also going to need an existing crop top or tank top that already fits you. One thing to keep in mind is the stretchiness of both items that you're going to be using for your shirts, because if this one's a lot stretchier than the band t-shirt you're working with, you're gonna need to remember to add some extra seam allowance. I'll go over that when we start getting into cutting and sewing your pattern. The other thing you're going to need is you're going to need some cool fabric that you're going to use for the straps. You can also, if you just want something a little bit simpler, you can get like some readily available elastic and you can use that instead. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make your own straps out of whatever fabric you like. You can also go to thrift stores and you can score some really cool finds for cheap by just like buying a t-shirt that you like the print of and then just using the scraps of that to make some straps. You're also going to need some craft paper. If you're on a budget, you can also grab like some old newspapers and use that. The only problem that you're probably going to get with that is for some of the bigger patterns that we might do in the future, you might not have enough paper to cover the width or length of it. But for something like crop top, you could totally use old newspaper and be eco-friendly. Another thing you're going to need is fabric scissors. You do not want to use just ordinary craft scissors. They suck and just don't, okay? I'm going to say it in every video. Another thing you're going to need is a watercolor pencil. They sell these at craft stores or at art stores. It's nice for drawing lines on the t-shirt that you're going to be using, so that way you can kind of see where it lays out and everything before you actually start cutting it, and you don't wind up with the logo all off to one side and all askew and uneven. So really great tool to use. You also need some sewing pins. I have this cool little magnetic dish, so that way only some of them fall all over the floor, but the majority of them are still in there. You also need a yardstick or a ruler. Yardsticks are great because they're a lot bigger, so for other projects you're going to need that, but for this one, a ruler will do. You also need a marker, like Sharpie, pencil, pretty much any kind of drawing supply. You're also going to need one of my favorite craft tools. Rivets. You will also need a mallet and a sewing awl. And you will also need a setting tool for whatever kind of rivets you're using. You can find these on Amazon, Etsy, eBay, all sorts of places. My personal favorite place to get these is an Etsy seller called Minkus Margo. Love that shop. And that's everything that you're gonna need. Oh, you will also need a sewing machine. You can sew by hand, but for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm not going to be showing any hand sewing techniques.
Alright, so your first step is going to be to lay your shirt that you're using as a guide out flat. Try to smooth out the edges as much as you can. Next, you're going to take your Sharpie. You're going to trace along the edges of the top. Now next, you're going to draw outside the edges to allow for a seam allowance, which is basically just giving yourself enough room to fold over edges, sew edges together, things like that. Remember that if your t-shirt that you're using as a guide is much stretchier than the band t-shirt you're going to be cutting out, that you want to give extra seam allowance for that. Now you're going to take you're not going to use your fabric scissors. You're going to take these craft scissors here because If you use fabric scissors on paper, you're going to make them very dull and you're going to ruin them. So now we're taking the craft scissors and cutting out our pattern. Alright, and it should look something like this. Now I'm going to need some more craft paper because I didn't have enough space on this one to allow for the seam allowance, so I'm just going to roll some of this out. Since it kind of tends to roll back up, I'm using some heavy weighted objects just to lay it flat. If you're using newspaper and being eco-friendly, it should just lay flat on its own. You're going to follow the same steps, laying out your shirt as flat as possible, and you're going to take your Sharpie and trace around all the edges. Now that you've done that, do the exact same thing. Give yourself a seam allowance. About a tip of your fingertip is usually a good guideline. If you're a little bit more of an experienced seamstress, you probably need less of a seam allowance because your stitches are going to be more close and precise. And you're going to be cutting it out with your craft scissors. Remember, not the fabric scissors. If anybody uses your fabric scissors for anything other than cutting out fabric, well, I can't condone any violence or anything like that, but, you know, I wouldn't judge you if you did. Next, you're going to take your ruler, and this is going to be your guideline for drawing out the straps of your top. So basically, you're just going to trace around the whole ruler. If you want them a little bit wider, you can give a little bit more seam allowance to that, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to leave them about this length. Once again, using the craft scissors. Do not use your sewing scissors on paper. Should look something like that. Now you're going to lay your shirt out flat, smooth out all the edges so you have a nice, good base to work with. You're going to lay your pattern that you've made for the front of the shirt down, weigh it down with some heavy objects, or you can also pin it down if you like. I'm wetting the tip of this watercolor pencil with my tongue, but you can also keep a dish of water handy if that's more your thing and you're a germaphobe. After you've traced out your pattern, make sure that it looks good and nice and even. If it does, you're prepared to start cutting. Only cut into the front side of the shirt. Don't cut all the way through, or else the front and the back pieces are going to look identical. Which can work, but I wanted this one to be a racer back design in the back because I like those. So yeah, I'm just cutting out the front part of the pattern. Alright, should look something like this. Perfect. Now we're going to do the exact same thing except with the back of the shirt. So lay the back piece of your t-shirt down and go ahead and set down your pattern as a guideline. Same step. Go ahead and wet your watercolor pencil and use it to trace a guideline. You can also add a cool fabric or something to the back of it, like, like if you find a cool like plaid or striped top, you can give it a little more zazz that way. I'm just keeping this one simple and a low supply list for you guys. Now you're going to go ahead and cut out your pattern with the tracing that you've done along it. Going slow and with control is always good. Try not to rush the project. I know my video's sped up, so I just want to remind you guys, taking your time is important and will make a better project. Next, you're going to take the fabric you're going to use for the straps. I got this cool fuzzy red zebra print. I'm going to lay out my pattern and I'm going to cut along using a guideline. I realized that it might move around a little bit, so I used some coins to just kind of weight it down. Thankfully, this fabric does not fray, so I'm not going to have to do a zigzag stitch before I make the straps. If you are using something like a denim where it kind of starts to fall apart at the edges, you are going to want to do a zigzag stitch along all of the edges before you actually continue on with the rest of this project. All right. Next, we're going to start preparing the tank top for having the top edges finished. So basically what I'm doing right here is I'm taking the edge of the fabric, I'm folding it over twice and then pinning it down. You can kind of see in this shot what I'm doing here. This skips the step of having to do a zigzag stitch prior, and it keeps your t-shirt from rolling up and stuff like that, and has a nice finish to it. It also gives a lot more thickness to the fabric, which is great for setting the rivets at the very end of this project. It takes a little bit of getting used to this technique a couple times over, and you'll start to get the hang of it. now that you got it all pinned down, it should look something like this. Now you're gonna do the exact same thing with the back of the t-shirt. You're just gonna fold it over once and then roll it over again and pin. Rolled up all the armpit seams and the bust and the back seam. Now we're gonna start prepping up the straps. So you're just gonna fold it over to the back side of the fabric, and you're just gonna roll the fabric down, keeping a nice even fold along the edges. You're gonna repeat the same with the other side of it. You can also use your ruler as a guideline to make sure that it's straight and even. I was pretty confident in my cutting and in my pinning in this, so I skipped that step, but it's something that you can do if you're not quite certain if it's gonna look wonky or not. You're gonna repeat the same for the second strap. Now that you got all this going, it's time to start sewing. We are gonna be using a reinforced straight stitch, which has a lot of stretch to it. If your machine does not have this function, you can use a zigzag stitch, which will give you a lot of give. You don't want to use just an ordinary straight stitch, or else when you put your top on and you're moving and stretching around in it, you're gonna pop seams. You're just gonna make sure to remove your sewing pins as you're guiding it through there. The machine will actually guide the fabric along. You mostly just kind of want to direct it where it's going. You don't want to pull or tug on the fabric as it's going through. And make sure to remove your sewing pins as the machine guides it along, because you don't want your needle to hit one of those, because usually your needle will break and then you'll be really sad because you have to rethread your sewing machine. Whenever you're finishing and starting a seam, I forgot to mention this, you always want to back the seam up using the reverse function on your sewing machine. That keeps the seam from the thread in the seam from popping as well. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and switch out our sewing needles. The particular fabric that I'm using for the straps is very thick and heavy, so I'm using a denim sewing needle. You definitely want to make sure that you're getting the right type of needle for the type of fabric that you're working with. It'll make your machine run better. You'll avoid things like skip stitches or your machine tangling up the thread and stuff like that. So yeah, just make sure as you're going along that you're keeping the correct needle in there for whatever type of fabric you're using. I'm just using that reinforced straight stitch to sew down the straps. Now that I'm finished with that one, I'm going to do the exact same thing for the other strap. Alright, and now we're going through and doing the other side, exact same thing, reinforced straight stitch, just letting the machine guide it through. Now that I've done that, just for the pure aesthetics of it, I'm going to go through and I'm going to do another little straight stitch just right alongside the other one. I just personally like the way it looks, and I feel like it kind of gives it a little second amount of security in the strap. So doing that on both of these straps here. Alright, next I'm going to pin the straps onto the back of the tank top. So I do that for a number of reasons. The main one being, if you don't have a mannequin to put your t-shirt on to measure how long you want your straps, it is a major pain to sew it on the front of the t-shirt first and then try to struggle with pinning something to the back of you and constantly adjusting and taking the shirt on and off again. So yeah, when you have it pinned down, it should look something like this. Now we're gonna go ahead and just use that reinforced straight stitch again. I am keeping the denim sewing needle in because I'm still working with this thick fabric. And I'm doing 2 straight stitches in different areas to secure the strap on here. I just really like having my seams really secure on there so I don't have to go back on sewing projects and readjust things. Just really makes it nice and durable. Alright, now we're gonna lay our shirt down flat with the band logo facing up. We're gonna place our other piece of the shirt on top of it. Basically you wanna have your shirt laying down as though it were inside out. So that way, after you sew these seams and you turn it inside out, you have a perfect stitch and you're not gonna see the seams. You're gonna pin along the edges nice and straight. Constantly just flattening and laying it out to make sure that you are pinning it nice and even. And the first couple times that you're doing sewing projects, I would advise that before you actually stitch things down, that you inside out the top and just make sure that you pinned everything correctly, because having to deal with a seam ripper afterwards is just disheartening. It really is. I'm changing my sewing needle back to the stretch stitch one because I don't want to put a denim one through this because it's going to puncture too big of a hole in my fabric because it's designed for a much heavy duty fabric. Take a little quick coffee break. All right, and now we're ready to get back to sewing. So I'm going to do the reinforced straight stitch again to start this one. The same for the other side of the shirt. Next, I'm going to switch it to a zigzag stitch. This is going to keep your shirt from kind of ripping apart at the side seams and stuff like that, even though we did use that reinforced straight stitch. The other function this is going to have is that the sides aren't going to like roll up and things like that. It's basically just to give it a little security, make sure your edges don't fray or roll. Perfect. Now that we've done that to both sides, I'm pretty much just going to pin that little excess amount of fabric down to the back of the shirt and give it just a quick little stitch. You don't have to go all the way down. It just kind of makes like the edges of the shirt look a little more seamless, and if they don't line up perfectly, it's a good way to kind of like mend them together and just kind of hide any little imperfections in your sewing project. Just make sure that you don't accidentally sew both sides of your shirt together when you're doing this. All right, next we are gonna adjust the bottom seam. So basically I'm gonna take it and I'm just gonna fold it over one time and I'm gonna pin it in place. Just like that. We're gonna follow this all the way across there. Try to make it as even as possible. We're we're gonna repeat the process on the back side of the shirt. I'm checking to make sure that the sides of it are equal length. If they're not, just go ahead and unpin it, give it a little adjustment. It's a lot easier to fix this before you start sewing than after you've finished your project. Like I said, we're repeating the process on the back of this, just laying along those sewing pins. And now I'm going to give it one last check just to make sure that it's straight all the way across. I got a little bit of a bumpiness in the middle there that I'm fixing. And there it is, it's perfect. Now we're gonna go ahead and sew this down. Make sure you don't accidentally sew both sides of your shirt together. I did that a lot in my early sewing years where I just drop it on the machine and just start sewing without checking that there wasn't the other half of my shirt underneath it. And then, you know, good night of crying with the seam ripper. All right, and now we start pinning the straps to the front of the shirt. If you don't have O-rings, I kind of forgot to mention those at the beginning of the tutorial, you can just pin them directly to the front of the shirt and sew them down, but I really like the look of the O-rings, so you just pin them to the front of the shirt, folding it over, and then you take the straps, guide them through, and then fold them over and pin them in place, just like I'm doing in the video here. Now, go ahead and take some measuring tape and check that your straps are even length, which they are. If you don't have this, go ahead and take a piece of string. You can measure it and then compare it to your ruler. And then we're just going to do a reinforced straight stitch to attach these to the straps and to the front of the t-shirt. I'm switching back and forth between the stretch needle and the denim needle for whichever fabric I'm working on. Now we're ready for my favorite part, setting rivets on it. I just love the little details that these things give. You're going to take the post of it, which pretty much is the piece that looks like a nipple, and that is going to connect to the cap of it. They snap inside like so. You'll kind of hear a little snap when you put them together, and the fabric is going to be in between those two pieces when you do that. I'll show you a little bit more after this. So I'm using some measuring tape, or you can use your ruler to just mark with my watercolor pencil where you're going to want each rivet. If you do it by hand, they might come out kind of uneven or kind of wonky, which can be a look if you want it that way, but I kind of like the even spacing and stuff. Next, you're going to take your sewing awl, make little punctures into the shirt. You don't want it to go all the way through because otherwise you're going to have too big of a hole and you're going to lose some rivets. So just the tip. Do that all the way through until you get to the end. Now you're going to take the post, the little nipple-shaped part, and you're going to force it into the little hole. I'm kind of struggling with this first one here. Come on, get in there. Come on. Almost there, almost there, almost there, almost there. And it's in. All right, then you're going to place the cap onto it, push it until you hear it snap, and you're going to follow this all the way through. Now, just because it snaps does not mean it's set in place. It can still pop off, which is going to lead us to our next step. Once you've gotten all your rivets laid out along the collar, you're going to lay everything down. I have this nice little like mat setting tool, but honestly you can do it just straight on the floor. This just keeps me from ruining my sewing desk even further. Now you're going to take the anvil, place it underneath the post. Now you're going to take the setting tool. You want the concave side to fit over the cap. Then you're going to strike it with the mallet. And you can kind of see how it's started to flatten out in the back. Yeah, perfect. So that's how you'll know that it's set in place. And you're just going to follow through and set each rivet with a nice strike of the mallet, following the anvil underneath, and the concave side goes over the cap. Perfect, and there it is, all with our pretty little rivets on it. So if you like my video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you have any input on what kind of projects you'd like to see me do in the future, please say so in the comments below. Thanks for watching.